The year 1421, Bohemia. At the walls of Rábí castle, clinging to a rocky cliff, the day was damp and gray. The air, thick with the smoke of burning suburbs, moist fog, and the acrid smell of gunpowder, was torn by the cries of attackers, the groans of the wounded, and the dry, snapping crackle of arquebuses, a new and terrible weapon that was changing the face of war. At the center of this seething cauldron, at the very spearhead of the attack, stood a man whose name had already become a nightmare for all of Catholic Europe. A man deprived of one eye, yet who saw the battlefield more clearly than any with sight. His name was Jan Žižka of Trocnov, hetman of the Taborites, the Scourge of God, the invincible leader of an army of apostates. Under his command, peasants armed with flails had time and again put the steel-clad knightly cavalry of the emperor to flight. The siege was drawing to a close. The defenders of the castle, exhausted and demoralized, were broken. Žižka, as always, was in the thick of the fight, his hoarse voice, accustomed to command, drowning out the noise of battle. He stood by an old pear tree, pointing out the last breach in the defenses to his commanders, when a shadow flickered from a narrow embrasure above him. And in the next instant a sharp, unbearable pain shot through him. An arrow, fired by a desperate defender or perhaps a genius in his last effort, did not kill him. It pierced his only good eye. The world, which for him was already half dark, plunged into absolute impenetrable blackness. His warriors, seeing their leader collapse to the ground with a bloodied face, erupted in a furious roar that crashed down on the fortress with new force. But at that moment, as darkness closed in on Jan Žižka, no one could yet imagine that this was not the end. It was the birth of a legend, the legend of a blind commander who, without seeing the light, would lead his people through the fire and blood of the greatest religious war of his time, and who would not lose a single battle. To understand how this indomitable leader was forged from an impoverished southern Bohemian nobleman, a mercenary, and possibly even a brigand, we must return to the very heart of Europe, to a kingdom that stood on the brink of a storm ready to change the course of history. Before Jan Žižka himself takes the stage, we must understand the world that produced him. Bohemia, or the Czech kingdom, at the end of the 14th and beginning of the 15th century, was not just one of many European countries. It was the center of the Holy Roman Empire, its cultural, political, and spiritual heart. The empire at that time was a patchwork quilt of hundreds of kingdoms, duchies, bishoprics, and free cities, formally united under the authority of an elected emperor. And this center was afflicted by a profound crisis that, like a slow poison, was corroding the foundations of society, preparing the ground for an unprecedented explosion. Just a few decades before the events described, Bohemia was experiencing its golden age. This was the reign of Charles IV of the Luxembourg dynasty, who was both King of Bohemia and Holy Roman Emperor. Charles was an outstanding monarch. Wise, educated, far-sighted, he was the complete opposite of the medieval warrior king. A polyglot, an expert in theology and law, he preferred the pen to the sword and diplomacy to war. His main achievement as emperor was the famous legislative act known as the Golden Bull of 1356. This act defined for centuries the procedure for electing the emperor by a college of 7 electors, effectively turning the empire into an aristocratic oligarchy. The document stabilized the ever-turbulent political life of the empire, but also cemented its decentralized character. But Charles's true passion was his native Bohemia. He transformed Prague into one of the most magnificent capitals of Europe, which was called the Rome of the North. Prague became a construction site of faith and ambition. Under Charles, the best architects of Europe, such as Matthias of Arras and Peter Parler, worked here, creating the unique Gothic appearance of St. Vitus Cathedral and the Charles Bridge. The royal court became a center of the arts where the Bohemian school of painting and book illumination flourished. creating luxurious illuminated manuscripts. By his order, the majestic St. Vitus Cathedral was erected, to which he brought relics of saints from all over Europe. He rebuilt Prague Castle and founded the new town, also known in Czech as Nové Město, doubling the capital's area. In 1348, he founded Charles University, the first in Central Europe, which quickly became one of the largest intellectual centers. Within its walls, modeled on the Sorbonne in Paris, students and professors were divided into 4 so-called nations, or regional groups: Bohemian, Bavarian, Saxon, and Polish. The economic power of the kingdom was ensured by the richest silver mines. The local silver groschen was one of the most stable and respected currencies in Europe, a kind of medieval dollar. But while Prague glittered and silver flowed into the coffers of the king and church hierarchs, the foundation of this prosperity was riddled with deep social tension. Thousands of miners toiled in hellish conditions, in narrow, dark, and poorly ventilated shafts where cave-ins and diseases were commonplace. For the common peasant, life was an endless cycle of labor on land that did not belong to him. He was obliged to pay a tithe to the local monastery or bishop, perform corvée labor in the Lord's field, and give a part of his harvest to his feudal lord. At the same time, he saw how the abbots of powerful monasteries lived like princes, feasting, hunting, and building luxurious churches, while his own parish priest could be as poor and illiterate as he was. This stark contrast between the ostentatious luxury of the higher clergy and the poverty of the common people bred a silent hatred. Reformist preachers would later point to this as living proof that the official church served not God but mammon. After Charles's death in 1378, his son Wenceslaus IV ascended the throne, and the Golden Age began to tarnish rapidly. Wenceslaus was the complete opposite of his father. Lazy, capricious, prone to drunkenness and fits of uncontrolled rage, he was little interested in state affairs. He preferred hunting and feasts to tedious council meetings, surrounding himself with favorites from the lesser nobility, which infuriated the great magnates. He entered into prolonged conflicts with the high nobility and church hierarchs who, united in the so-called League of Lords, twice took him prisoner, trying to force him to rule more responsibly. One of the biggest scandals was the tragic fate of John of Nepomuk, the vicar general of the Archbishop of Prague. The enraged king, suspecting him of intrigue, ordered him to be tortured and then, according to legend, thrown from the Charles Bridge in a sack. This act of lawlessness shocked the entire kingdom. Wenceslaus's inaction and inability to manage affairs in the empire led to German electors stripping him of the title of Holy Roman Emperor, electing Rupert of the Palatinate in his place. This was a terrible humiliation for the Czech kingdom. The country, accustomed to being the center of the empire, turned into its rebellious, problematic periphery. The king's power weakened to such an extent that feudal anarchy reigned throughout the country. This was not just a power vacuum, but a state of almost constant low-level warfare, where the private armies of feuding barons burned villages and plundered trade routes with complete impunity. Justice became the privilege of the strong, and for a minor nobleman like Jan Žižka, the only way to survive and defend his rights was often the sword. The roads were infested with robber bands, for whom robbery became the only source of livelihood in this crumbling world. This political chaos was compounded by a profound spiritual crisis that gripped all of Europe. It was the time of the Great Schism. Since 1378, 2, and at times even 3, popes simultaneously sat on the papal throne, one in Rome, the other in Avignon, cursing each other, imposing anathemas and demanding money and obedience from the faithful. The authority of the papacy had fallen to an unprecedented low. The Christian world was in turmoil. Who was the true vicar of St. Peter? And nowhere was this felt as acutely as in Bohemia. The Catholic Church in Bohemia was the largest landowner. It owned almost a third of all land in the kingdom. The Archbishop of Prague, Jan of Genstein, openly feuded with King Wenceslaus, behaving like a secular prince. Powerful monasteries functioned more like large corporations. They owned not only villages and fields but also breweries, fish ponds, and mills. They collected tithes and demanded exorbitant fees for baptism, marriage, or burial. Bishops and abbots lived in luxury rivaling that of princes, while parish priests were often ignorant, poor, and no different from their flock. Simony, the open sale of church offices, flourished. The highest posts in the church were occupied not by the most worthy but by those who could pay for them, and often these were foreigners, mostly Germans. The sale of indulgences, certificates of remission of sins which had turned from an act of penance into a blatant commercial transaction, caused enormous irritation. Church courts interfered in secular affairs, and the vast wealth of the church flowed out of the country to Rome or Avignon to support the lavish papal courts. This tangle of problems was exacerbated by a sharp national conflict. Since the medieval German colonization, a large number of Germans lived in Bohemia. They were skilled craftsmen, merchants, and miners. They constituted a significant and at times dominant part of the urban population and held key positions in governance, the church, and at Prague University, where the three German nations, Saxon, Bavarian, and Polish, had 3 votes against 1 for the Czechs. German masters in city guilds often created obstacles for Czech apprentices, and the city councils of many royal towns were controlled by the German patriciate. For the growing Czech national consciousness, this was not just a matter of economics, but a matter of national dignity. The demands for church reform were closely intertwined with demands for national liberation from the economic and cultural dominance of the Germans. Thus, by the beginning of the 15th century, Bohemia was a cauldron in which the social discontent of peasants and lesser nobility, the political anarchy caused by a weak king, the national enmity between Czechs and Germans, and a deep disillusionment with the official church were boiling. All these forces converged at one point. In Prague, within the walls of its university, and in the fiery sermons that resounded in its churches. The cauldron was ready to explode. All that was missing was a spark. And that spark would soon be struck by a man whose name would become the banner of the coming storm. And while kings and feudal lords were dividing power and robber bands roamed the roads of Bohemia from the quiet of university lecture halls and the pulpits of Prague's churches, a voice was heard that was destined to shake the foundations of the Christian world. This voice belonged to a man of humble origins but of unbending will and brilliant mind. His name was Jan Hus. He was born around 1370 in a poor peasant family in the town of Husinec in southern Bohemia. The only social ladder for a gifted young man from the lower classes in that era was a church career. He graduated brilliantly from Prague University, became a Master of Liberal Arts, and then Dean of the Arts Faculty. The university at that time was seething not only with scholarly but also with fierce philosophical debates. The main one was the confrontation between realism, which asserted that universal concepts like humanity or justice were real, and nominalism, which considered them merely names. Hus and most of the Czech masters were realists, while the Germans leaned towards nominalism. This was not abstract scholasticism, but a battle for the very nature of truth and the possibility of knowing it. But his true calling became theology and preaching. From 1402, he became the rector and preacher at the private Bethlehem Chapel in Prague's Old Town. The Bethlehem Chapel was a unique place. It was founded specifically so that sermons there would be delivered not in Latin, understood only by the educated elite, but in the native Czech language. Every Sunday and on feast days, up to 3,000 people, including artisans, merchants, students, knights, and even courtiers of Queen Sophia, flocked here to listen to their beloved preacher. and Hus told them what they felt but could not express. He was not a revolutionary in the political sense. He was a deeply religious man who dreamed of cleansing the church of filth and returning it to the ideals of early Christianity, to the simplicity and poverty of apostolic times. Relying on the works of the English reformer John Wycliffe, whose works were secretly brought to Prague, Hus launched a devastating critique of the vices of the clergy. He spoke of the unacceptability of simony, the greed of bishops, the moral decay of monks. He argued that the true head of the church is not a corrupt and sinful pope, but Jesus Christ himself. He declared that every believer should read and interpret the Bible for himself, which is the highest authority, and not blindly obey the orders of churchmen. But his most important and, as it turned out, most explosive demand was for communion for the laity in both kinds, meaning not only with bread, the body of Christ, but also with wine, the blood of Christ. At that time, the Catholic Church gave communion with wine only to priests, which, in the opinion of Hus and his followers, was a gross violation of the gospel, and placed the clergy in a privileged position over the laity, making them intermediaries without whom salvation was impossible. The chalice with wine, or kalik in Czech, became the main symbol of his teaching, a symbol of the equality of all people before God. Those who followed his teaching became known as Calixtines, or Utraquists, a name derived from the Latin phrase sub utraque specie, which means in both kinds. Hus's sermons were a colossal success. He became the spiritual leader of the Czech people. He was supported by Queen Sophia and even by King Wenceslaus IV himself, for whom criticism of the rich and independent clergy was politically advantageous. In 1409, under pressure from Hus and his supporters, Wenceslaus issued the Kutna Hora decree, which changed the statutes of Prague University, giving the Czech nation 3 votes against 1 for the 3 German nations combined. This was a huge national victory. In protest, several thousand German professors and students left Prague, founding a new university in Leipzig. But the louder Hus's voice became, the more irritation it caused among the church authorities in Rome. He was accused of heresy, of spreading the ideas of Wycliffe, which had already been condemned. The Archbishop of Prague forbade him to preach, but Hus did not obey. In 1412, when another campaign to sell indulgences began in Prague, organized by one of the anti-popes, John XXIII, to finance a war against the King of Naples, Hus protested sharply. He called it trafficking in sacred things. Unrest began in Prague. 3 young artisans who spoke out against indulgences were arrested and beheaded. Hus declared them martyrs. Rome's patience was exhausted. Hus was excommunicated and an interdict was placed on Prague, that is, a ban on all divine services, baptisms, weddings, and funerals as long as the heretic was in the city. To avoid endangering the city, Hus left the capital and took refuge in the castles of his patrons among the Czech nobility. But even there, he did not stop writing and preaching. His ideas spread throughout the country. To resolve the crisis in the church and put an end to heresies, an ecumenical council was convened, which opened in 1414 in the German city of Constance. It was a grand theater of European power, attended by cardinals, bishops, princes, theologians, and ambassadors from all over the continent. The council had 2 main goals: to end the Great Schism by electing a single pope, and to eradicate heresies, the main of which was considered the teaching of Wycliffe and Hus. The new emperor, Sigismund, brother of King Wenceslaus and heir to the Czech throne, saw Hus as the main threat to stability in his future kingdom. He invited Hus to the council so that he could defend his views, and solemnly promised him personal safety by issuing a letter of safe conduct, also known as a salvus conductus. Hus, believing in his righteousness and in the emperor's word, agreed. It was a fatal decision. As soon as he arrived in Constance, despite the safe conduct, He was arrested and thrown into a damp, cold dungeon in a castle on the shore of Lake Constance. Emperor Sigismund, faced with the choice of keeping his word to a heretic or submitting to the will of the Council Fathers, chose the latter. The Council Fathers exerted immense pressure on him, arguing that oaths given to heretics were not valid. Sigismund betrayed Hus. A long and humiliating trial began. Hus was kept in inhuman conditions, starved and moved from one prison to another. One of these was in the tower of a Dominican monastery directly above a foul-smelling cesspool. He was presented with a list of 30 accusations torn from his books and sermons, often distorting their meaning. He was accused of heretical views on the nature of the Church, on papal authority, on the sacraments. But despite illness and abuse, his spirit was not broken. In letters that he secretly managed to pass to friends in Prague, he wrote, "Seek the truth, listen to the truth, learn the truth, love the truth, speak the truth, hold to the truth, and defend the truth until death." He was required to do one thing, to recant his errors. But Hus refused. He was ready to discuss his views on the basis of Holy Scripture, but not to blindly recant what he believed. On July 6, 1415, the council delivered its verdict. Jan Hus was declared an unrepentant heretic and sentenced to be burned at the stake. The ceremony was staged with maximum humiliation. His priestly vestments were torn from him, and a paper cap with a depiction of devils and the inscription Heresiarcha, which meant arch-heretic, was placed on his head. As he was led to his execution, he sang psalms. Seeing a simple peasant woman who, in a fit of piety, threw a bundle of faggots onto his pyre, he, according to tradition, uttered his famous phrase, "O sancta simplicitas," or "O holy simplicity." Tied to the stake, he refused for the last time to recant. When the flames engulfed him, he, according to eyewitnesses, began to sing, "Jesus Christ, Son of the living God, have mercy on me." His ashes were collected and thrown into the Rhine so that no trace of him would remain, so that his followers would have no relics. But the Council Fathers had miscalculated badly. The execution of Hus did not extinguish the fire but turned it into an all-consuming blaze. The news of Sigismund's betrayal and the martyrdom of their prophet caused an explosion of unprecedented fury in Bohemia. The entire Czech nation, from peasant to aristocrat, perceived it as an insult to their national honor and faith. More than 450 Czech and Moravian nobles signed a letter of protest in which they declared Hus a holy martyr. The chalice became the banner of the nation. The country was rapidly heading towards open rebellion. And in this whirlwind of events, in the shadow of the aging king at whose court he served, was a man who would soon turn popular anger into an organized military force. A man who would become the sword of the Hussite Revolution. And while a storm was brewing in Bohemia, caused by the teachings and martyrdom of Jan Hus, the man who was destined to become its chief military genius led a life shrouded in mist and full of enigmas. The early years of Jan Žižka of Trocnov are a field for historians' conjectures and hypotheses based on fragmentary and often contradictory documents. He was not a prince or a great aristocrat whose birth and every step were recorded in chronicles. He came from the environment of the minor, impoverished nobility, the so-called Zemans, who formed the backbone of the kingdom's military and administrative system. His exact date of birth is unknown, but most historians place it around 1360. He was born in the small village of Trocnov in southern Bohemia, into a family belonging to the lowest stratum of the nobility. His family had a small court and a few patches of land. This was not enough for a comfortable life, but enough to consider himself a nobleman and to bear arms. The life of such a man was a constant struggle for survival and status. Southern Bohemia at that time was a restless region where the powerful and rich Rosenberg family constantly conflicted with the king and with smaller feudal lords. It is quite likely that Žižka's youth was spent in an atmosphere of constant minor wars, skirmishes, and raids. It was a harsh school of life that taught survival, cunning, and the art of war not from books but in practice. Apparently, his family's financial situation was dire. Documents attest to numerous lawsuits related to debts and land disputes. In a document from 1406, Jan Žižka is mentioned as a man selling his last property. He had become a landless nobleman. For such a man in that era, there were three paths: to enter the service of a rich lord, to become a priest, or to take to the high road, and, it seems, Žižka for a time chose the third path. For several years, from approximately 1406 to 1409, his name appears in court records in connection with the activities of a robber band that operated in southern Bohemia and on the border with Austria. This band, led by a certain Matěj Vůdce, feuded with the powerful Rosenbergs and the town of České Budějovice. This was not banditry for profit in its pure form. Rather, it was a form of privatized warfare typical of an era of lawlessness. Žižka and his men probably acted as irregular partisan forces, perhaps even with the tacit approval of factions loyal to the king in their struggle against the overly powerful Rosenbergs. In this cruel world, he learned to live off the land, to command loyalty in a small, cohesive detachment, and to value initiative and cunning over blind adherence to rules. This was the very inferno where the future commander was forged. It was in one of these skirmishes, probably, that he lost his left eye. The details of this event are unknown, but from then on he became known as Žižka, the One-Eyed. This wound only hardened his already stern character. Somehow, perhaps thanks to an amnesty declared by King Wenceslaus IV in 1409, Žižka managed to legalize his position. His dark robber past was left behind. The next vivid episode in his biography takes us far beyond Bohemia. In 1410, his name appears on the lists of Czech and Moravian mercenaries who fought on the side of the Polish-Lithuanian army against the Teutonic Order in the famous Battle of Grunwald. The Battle of Grunwald was one of the largest battles of the Middle Ages. Tens of thousands of warriors clashed on a huge field. It was a clash of worlds, the Germanic crusading order against a Slavic coalition. Participation in it gave Žižka, who was already about 50 years old, unique experience. He saw a large organized army in action and understood that the era of invincible knights was coming to an end. He was able to assess the strengths and weaknesses of knightly tactics. He saw with his own eyes how the disciplined Smolensk infantry regiments, fighting on the Lithuanian side, withstood the onslaught of the elite Teutonic cavalry, giving the Allied cavalry precious time to regroup for a decisive counterattack. It was a powerful lesson that steadfast infantry, correctly positioned and motivated, could break the wave of a knightly charge. This experience, in combination with his growing interest in artillery, laid the foundation for the tactical system that would soon instill terror in Europe. Returning to Bohemia as a hero of Grunwald, Žižka entered the service of King Wenceslaus IV's court. He held a modest position as a courtier, a doorkeeper for Queen Sophia, responsible for guarding and maintaining order in her chambers. It was not a high but an honorable position which gave him access to the king and allowed him to be aware of all political intrigues. He was already an elderly, experienced warrior with a face cut by scars and with one eye that saw the world in its true, cruel light. During these years, he grew closer to the Hussite movement. He, like many Czech nobles, was outraged by German dominance and the wealth of the church, Hus's sermons on social justice and equality before God found a lively response in his heart. He became a fervent supporter of reform. He saw how popular anger was growing, how Prague was turning into a powder keg. He saw the weakness and indecision of King Wenceslaus, unable to cope with the situation. And he waited. The experienced warrior, hardened in dozens of battles, who knew the price of life and death, was waiting for the moment when his skills and his fury would be needed for a new cause. And that moment was very near. The execution of Jan Hus in Constance was the spark that ignited the Czech cauldron. The entire country was set in motion. Spontaneous attacks on monasteries and the homes of wealthy priests began throughout Bohemia. Priests loyal to Hus's teachings began to openly administer communion to the laity with wine, and thousands of people flocked to them. The chalice became a battle banner. But this was no longer enough. A new phenomenon appeared: mass pilgrimages to mountains. Tens of thousands of people, including peasants, artisans, and minor nobles, gathered in the open air on hills, to which they gave biblical names like Mount Tabor or Horeb. Here they listened to the fiery speeches of radical preachers who foretold the imminent end of the world and the coming of the kingdom of God, where there would be neither kings nor lords, neither rich nor poor. These gatherings created a powerful sense of unity and prepared the people for a holy war. Particularly radical sentiments prevailed in Prague. Here, the main exponent of popular anger was the preacher Jan Žižka, a former monk. Unlike the intellectual Hus, Žižka was a fiery demagogue who appealed directly to the feelings of Prague's poor. In his sermons at the Church of Our Lady of the Snows, he called for the immediate and merciless execution of all enemies of God's law. King Wenceslaus IV, frightened by the growing radicalism, tried to maneuver. Under pressure from his brother, Emperor Sigismund, he decided to take harsh measures. He restored Catholics and moderate Hussites to the city council of Prague's new town, and ordered the expulsion of radical priests from churches. This was the last straw. On July 30th, 1419, Jan Žižka led a huge procession of his supporters through the city to the new town hall, where the new city council was in session. At the head of the procession, the Holy Sacrament was carried. The mood of the crowd was extremely aggressive. As the procession passed, someone from a window of the town hall, according to tradition, threw a stone at the priest carrying the monstrance. This served as a signal. The crowd, led by Jan Žižka and, as many chronicles claim, Jan Žižka, who had joined the procession with his men, stormed the town hall. The members of the city council were seized, and here occurred the event that went down in history as the first defenestration of Prague. The burgomaster, judges, and several council members were dragged to the windows, and one by one thrown out onto the street, onto the spears and pikes of the crowd waiting below. Those who survived the fall were immediately finished off. This brutal act was the point of no return. It was an open rebellion, a challenge to royal authority. When King Wenceslaus, who was in a country castle, was informed of what had happened, he suffered an apoplectic stroke. A few days later, on August 16, 1419, he died. Bohemia was left without a king. Wenceslaus's death meant that by law the throne should pass to his brother, Emperor Sigismund. But for the Czechs, Sigismund was not a legitimate monarch, but a red fox, a traitor, on whose hands was the blood of their holy martyr, Jan Hus. To accept him as king meant betraying everything they had fought for. Bohemia refused to recognize Sigismund. A full-scale civil and religious war began. Immediately after the king's death, radical Hussites seized power in Prague. Pogroms of churches and monasteries, which they called nests of sin, began. Monks were beaten and expelled, and church property was looted. However, the Hussite movement was not united. It almost immediately split into two main wings. The first, more moderate wing consisted of the Calixtines, or Utraquists. It included Prague's burghers, most of the nobility, and university masters. Their program was set out in the famous 4 Articles of Prague, which demanded freedom to preach God's word, communion in both kinds for all believers, depriving the clergy of secular power and wealth, and punishment for mortal sins for all without exception, including clergy. The moderates were ready for a compromise with Sigismund and the Catholic Church if these requirements were met. The second radical wing was much more diverse. Its center became the new fortress city founded in southern Bohemia on Mount Tabor. Its followers came to be called Taborites. The Taborites rejected not only the authority of the Pope but the entire church hierarchy, lavish rituals, and the veneration of icons, relics, and saints. They wanted to build the kingdom of God on earth based on principles of social equality and brotherhood. In the early days in Tabor, there was even a community of property in the form of common barrels, into which everyone put their valuables. Their theology was much more radical, even to the point of denying the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, which later caused conflicts. The Taborites were uncompromising fighters, ready to fight to the end. It was to the Taborites that Jan Žižka joined. He left Prague, which he considered too moderate and prone to betrayal. The experienced warrior understood that the coming war would require not negotiations, but iron and blood. He saw that Sigismund and the new pope would never reconcile with the Czech heresy, and were preparing a crusade against Bohemia. And he began to prepare for this war. He began to create an army the world had never seen before. An army born of faith, fury, and the genius of a one-eyed warrior. While Emperor Sigismund and the newly elected Pope, Martin V, were gathering a huge army from all over Europe to eradicate the Czech heresy with fire and sword, Jan Žižka was solving a seemingly impossible task. He had to turn crowds of poorly armed peasants, artisans, and minor nobles into a combat-ready force capable of withstanding the world's best knightly cavalry. The Hussites had neither the money to hire professional soldiers nor a sufficient number of armor and war horses. Žižka had to counter the knights' strength with something else: discipline, tactical ingenuity, and revolutionary innovations. The core of his army became the Taborites. These people were fanatically devoted to their faith. They went into battle not for money or glory, but for the kingdom of God. Their battle hymn was the formidable chorale Ktoś su Boží bojovníci, which translates as "Ye who are warriors of God." The sound of this chorale struck superstitious terror into the hearts of their enemies. Žižka introduced iron discipline in his army, based on a military code adopted by the entire force. Any insubordination, drunkenness, gambling, or looting without orders was punished mercilessly, up to the death penalty. He created an army forged not only by common faith, but also by the strictest order. But his main brilliant innovation was the tactic of the Wagenburg, or wagon fort. The idea of using wagons in battle was not entirely new, but Žižka turned it into a perfect deadly system. He took ordinary peasant carts and turned them into mobile combat units. Each wagon was covered with thick wooden planks with loopholes for shooting. Sometimes they were further reinforced with wet hides for fire protection. Each wagon was a link in a great war machine. The crew of each wagon consisted of 18 to 20 men, including crossbowmen, handgunners, warriors with flails and pikes, and 2 drivers. Everyone knew their place and their task. At the moment of danger, on command, hundreds of such carts formed a circle or a square in a matter of minutes, chained to each other. The gaps between the wheels were filled with special pavis shields. Thus, an impregnable fortress arose on level ground, in an open field. The knightly cavalry, accustomed to deciding the outcome of a battle with one swift charge, was powerless against this wall of wood and iron. Any attack on the Wagenburg broke against the wall of shields and wagons. The attacking knights were shot at from close range by crossbows, handguns, and small cannons mounted on the wagons. Žižka was one of the first in history to fully appreciate the power of emerging artillery and handheld firearms. The Hussites established mass production of handguns, called pistola in Czech, and larger hakovnice, which got their name from the hook, or hack, with which the weapon was attached to a wall or wagon side to reduce recoil. They also actively used light field cannons, which they called hufnice, from which the modern word howitzer is derived. The fire of this primitive but numerous artillery threw the enemy ranks into disarray and mowed down their infantry. When the nightly charge faltered, when horses and men, wounded and discouraged, began to retreat, Žižka gave the second command. The chains between the wagons were unlinked, and the Hussite infantry burst out of the Wagenburg like a swarm of angry wasps, and it was a terrible sight. In the forefront were warriors armed with war flails. This was a simple peasant tool for threshing grain, turned into a deadly weapon. In the hands of a strong peasant, the spike-studded end of the flail was a terrible weapon that could not be easily parried with a sword, and its crushing force could disable a knight even through his armor. The blow of a flail could break a knight's helmet or knock a rider from his horse. Behind them came infantry with pikes, halberds, and swords who finished off the fallen and disorganized enemies. Žižka's tactic was simple but incredibly effective. It consisted of two phases: first, to wear down and bleed the enemy on the defensive by shooting at them from behind the walls of the Wagenburg, and then to deliver a crushing counterattack. This tactic completely changed the rules of warfare. It showed that disciplined, motivated, and competently led infantry armed with firearms and sheltered by field fortifications can defeat the best knightly cavalry. Žižka created a new type of army that remained invincible for a whole decade. This army underwent its first test on March 25, 1420, at the Battle of Sudomierz. Žižka's small detachment, numbering only about 400 people, including women and children, was overtaken by a 2,000-strong force of Knights of St. John. The situation seemed hopeless, but Žižka used the terrain. He positioned his 12 wagons on a narrow causeway between two drained ponds. The knights could not attack him on a wide front. Their charges bogged down in the mud and broke against the wall of wagons. After several unsuccessful attacks, having suffered heavy losses from Hussite fire, the knights were forced to retreat at dusk. This small but resounding victory showed all of Bohemia that Sigismund's army could and should be fought. It turned Žižka into the main military leader of the Hussites and instilled hope in the hearts of the rebels. Ahead of them lay the main test, the First Crusade. The victory at Sudomierz was only a prelude. In the spring of 1420, Emperor Sigismund, having received a papal bull declaring a crusade against the Hussites, assembled a huge army. According to various estimates, it numbered from 50 to 100,000 men. It included knights from all over the Holy Roman Empire, from Hungary, Poland, and Italy. The iron fist of the Catholic world was raised over Little Bohemia. The Crusaders' target was Prague. The Crusader army was a huge multilingual military camp, spread out before the walls of Prague. There were German dukes, Italian condottieri, Hungarian hussars, knights from all corners of Europe, each with his own retinue, banners and followers. They were united by faith and a thirst for glory, but divided by ambitions and a lack of unified command. An atmosphere of absolute self-confidence reigned in the camp. The Crusaders looked upon the Hussites as a mob of peasants and heretics who would be swept away by a single decisive charge of their plate-armored cavalry. They despised their opponents, understanding neither the strength of their faith nor the genius of their commander. The citizens of Prague, mostly moderate Calixtines, found themselves in a desperate situation. They appealed for help to all Hussites, including the Taborites, whom they disliked for their radicalism. Žižka, understanding that the fall of Prague would be the end of the whole movement, responded to the call. At the head of a 9,000-strong Taborite army, he made a swift march to the capital, crushing enemy detachments along the way. In June 1420, the Crusader army approached Prague and besieged it. Sigismund occupied Prague Castle and Vyšehrad, controlling the city from two sides. But the key to a complete blockade of the capital lay at one point. On Vítkov Hill, an elongated hill that protected Prague from the east and along which supply routes ran. Žižka immediately appreciated the strategic importance of this place. On top of the hill, he ordered a small fortification of wood and earth to be hastily built, defended by only a few dozen warriors. On July 14, 1420, Sigismund ordered a general assault. The main blow of the heavy knightly cavalry was directed at Vítkov Hill. Thousands of steel-clad horsemen rushed up the slopes of the hill, confident of an easy victory. But they were met with desperate resistance. The small garrison, led by Žižka himself, who arrived on the hill at the most critical moment, stood to the death. The Crusaders were pelted with stones and shot at with handguns. The narrow slopes did not allow the knights to deploy their might. At the decisive moment, when the defenders were already at the end of their strength, a sally from the city came to their aid. The Prague militia, with a battle cry, struck the Crusaders on the flank and in the rear. The knightly charge faltered. The huge army, seized with panic, turned and fled. The defeat on Vítkov Hill was a terrible moral blow to Sigismund. His gigantic multinational army, having failed in one battle, began to fall apart. Mercenaries not receiving pay dispersed. Soon Sigismund was forced to lift the siege of Prague and lead away the remnants of his army. The First Crusade had failed ingloriously. The victory on Vítkov Hill saved Prague and the Hussite Revolution, and Jan Žižka became a national hero, the savior of the fatherland. But Sigismund and the Pope were not going to give up. In 1421, a second, even more numerous crusade was organized. The Crusaders invaded Bohemia from two sides, but this time too they met with fiasco. Žižka, acting in his favorite manner, avoided large battles in the open field. He attacked individual detachments and wore down the enemy with guerrilla actions. Near the town of Žatec, the Crusader army, upon hearing a rumor of Žižka's approach and the sound of the Hussite battle hymn, simply fled without a fight. It was during these campaigns at the siege of Rábí castle that the tragic event with which we began our story occurred. An arrow deprived Žižka of his second last eye. It seemed that his career as a commander was over. How can a blind man command an army, direct complex maneuvers on the battlefield? But Žižka here too achieved the impossible. His blindness did not break him. On the contrary, it sharpened all his other senses. He, like no one else, knew every hill, every river, every road in his native Bohemia. He was driven in a special wagon in the center of the army. He was given detailed reports on the positions of his own and enemy forces, and he, creating a most detailed mental map of the terrain in his mind, gave precise and unerring orders. His authority was so high that his word was law. The soldiers believed that their blind leader was guided by God himself. And he continued to win. In January 1422, Sigismund made another attempt. At the head of a new army, he invaded Bohemia. Near the town of Kutná Hora, Žižka, finding himself surrounded, performed one of his most brilliant maneuvers. At night, he broke through the enemy ranks using his artillery as a battering ram, and then, having regrouped his forces, he inflicted a crushing defeat on Sigismund at the Battle of Německý Brod. The emperor's army was routed and fled, leaving a huge baggage train and all its artillery to the Hussites. After this defeat, Sigismund abandoned his attempts to conquer Bohemia for several years. It seemed the external enemy was defeated. But as often happens in revolutions, as soon as the direct threat disappeared, internal contradictions flared up with new force. And the most terrible enemy for the Hussites turned out to be within their own camp. The victories over the Crusaders did not bring peace to Bohemia. On the contrary, they only exacerbated the deep contradictions that had existed within the Hussite movement from the very beginning. The euphoria of a common struggle gave way to a fierce battle for power and for the future direction of the Czech Reformation. The two main wings of the movement, the moderate Prague Calixtines and the radical Taborites, drifted further and further apart. The Praguers, mostly wealthy burghers and nobles, were frightened by the radicalism of the Taborites. For the Prague masters, the chalice was the ultimate goal of the reform. For the Taborites, it was only the first step towards a complete restructuring of society. The Praguers wanted order, stability, and recognition of their faith by the rest of Europe. They were quite satisfied with the 4 Articles of Prague and were ready to compromise with Sigismund. The radical ideas of the Taborites about social equality threatened their own position and property. The gulf between Prague and Tabor was not just political. It was a fundamental divergence in views on the very nature of God and the Church. For the Prague masters, the goal was to reform the existing church. They respected the teachings of the Church Fathers and centuries-old traditions, seeking only to correct its most flagrant shortcomings. Their churches in Prague, though purged of excesses, still retained their splendor, and the liturgy, albeit with communion for all, followed the familiar canon. The Taborites, on the other hand, sought not reform but a complete revolution. Their guiding principle was sola scriptura, or scripture alone. In their simple prayer houses you would not see icons, statues, or lavish vestments, as they considered all these to be idolatry and mercilessly destroyed them in captured Catholic churches. The main bone of contention was the question of the Eucharist. The Calixtines, like the Catholics, believed in the real presence of Christ in the holy gifts. The Taborites, however, rejected the dogma of transubstantiation, considering the bread and wine merely symbols of Christ's body and blood. This was not a minor theological dispute. It was a chasm separating two worlds. For a Prague burgher, a Taborite preacher declaring the holy sacraments to be mere bread was a blasphemer. For a Taborite peasant, a Prague priest in richly decorated vestments was a servant of the Antichrist. In such an atmosphere, armed conflict was not a question of if, but when. The Taborites, in turn, despised the Praguers for their half-heartedness and readiness to deal with the Antichrist emperor. They dreamed of a complete break with the Catholic world. But Tabor itself was not united. An even more extreme left wing emerged within it, the so-called Picards or Adamites. They went as far as completely denying all sacraments, including the Eucharist, and preached, according to rumors, sexual freedom, walking around naked and considering themselves sinless like Adam and Eve before the fall. Jan Žižka, being a Taborite, was above all a pragmatist and a man of order. Radical sects that undermined discipline in the army enraged him. In 1421, he brutally suppressed the Adamites, practically annihilating them. But his paths also began to diverge from the main leadership of Tabor. He increasingly distrusted politicians and preachers, believing they were causing a split in the movement. In 1423, the final break occurred. Žižka, with his most loyal supporters, left Tabor and went to northeastern Bohemia. Here he founded a new military religious brotherhood, which was named the Orabites after Mount Horeb, where they gathered. This was his personal army, subordinate only to him. From this moment, one of the darkest periods of the Hussite Wars began, namely the period of internecine struggle. Prague, having allied with Catholic lords, decided to finish off the heretic Žižka. An army was sent against him, but they underestimated the military genius of the blind commander. On June 7th, 1424, at the Battle of Malashov, Žižka gave his former allies a graphic lesson in tactics. He positioned his Wagenburg on top of a hill. When the Prague army began its assault, he gave an order that has gone down in all military history textbooks. He ordered several wagons loaded with stones to be rolled down the hill. These improvised tanks crashed into the dense ranks of the attackers, sweeping away everything in their path and causing terrible confusion. Immediately after, the Orobyte infantry launched a devastating counterattack. The Prague army was completely routed. After this victory, the way to Prague was open. Žižka approached the capital and was ready to storm it. It seemed Bohemia was on the brink of a bloody civil war that would destroy all the gains of the revolution. But at the last moment, common sense prevailed. Through the mediation of a Hussite theologian, a truce was concluded. Žižka, understanding that the main enemy, Sigismund, was not yet defeated and was preparing a new campaign, agreed to peace. It was decided to organize a joint campaign of all Hussite forces into Moravia. At the head of a united army which once again included Taborites, Praguers, and his loyal Orobytes, Žižka set out on his last campaign. He was no longer young, he was over 60. Years of continuous wars, wounds, blindness, all this was undermining his iron health. But his will was still unbending. He remained the only figure capable of uniting the warring factions. Soldiers of all persuasions believed in him and followed him. They called themselves the Orphans because they knew that after the death of their great leader, they would have no other such father. And they were right. In the autumn of 1424, the united Hussite army under the command of Jan Žižka marched into Moravia. The goal of the campaign was the siege of the fortress of Přibyslav. The campaign was successful. But an enemy appeared in the Hussite camp that not even Žižka could defeat. An enemy invisible and merciless, the plague. The epidemic began to mow down the ranks of the warriors. And one of its victims was the old hetman himself. On October 11th, 1424, in the camp near the walls of Přibyslav, Jan Žižka died. He did not die by the sword or arrow, which had spared him in hundreds of battles. He died of disease like a common mortal, but his death was the death of a titan. Žižka's demise plunged the Hussite army into shock and despair. They had lost not just a commander, they had lost their leader, their symbol, their father. It was then that his loyal Orobyte warriors definitively adopted the name Orphans, vowing to continue his work. The body of the great commander was transported with honors and buried in Čáslav, in the cathedral of Saints Peter and Paul. Above his tomb they hung his favorite weapon, a simple iron-flanged mace. One of the most famous and gruesome legends is associated with his death. Allegedly, as he was dying, Žižka instructed his warriors to skin him after his death, stretch his skin over a drum and carry this drum at the head of the army, so that even after death, the sound of his skin would strike terror into the hearts of their enemies and lead his orphans to victory. This legend is most likely not a historical fact. It appeared in chronicles much later and was probably invented by his enemies to emphasize his savagery. But, like any great legend, it very accurately reflects the essence of the phenomenon. Even after death, Jan Žižka remained the banner and inspiration of the Hussite movement. Military leadership of the Orphans and Taborites passed to a new talented commander and priest, Prokop the Great. He was not a genius of Žižka's level, but he was a good strategist and managed to continue his work. Under his leadership, the Hussites repelled two more crusades in 1427 and 1431, winning brilliant victories at Prokop and Domážlik. In the latter battle, the Crusader army, upon hearing only the singing of the Hussite battle hymn, fled in panic even before the battle began. After these victories, the Hussites went on the counteroffensive. Their detachments began to conduct the so-called beautiful rides, or spanile jizdi, into neighboring German lands, Austria, Hungary, and Poland. These were not just plundering raids, although booty played an important role in financing the war. It was a strategy of exporting revolution and total war. The Hussites brought devastation with them, burning monasteries and cities to economically bleed their enemies and show that war could come to their land too. At the same time, they spread their ideas, their manifesto, the 4 Articles of Prague, sowing seeds of doubt and fear throughout Central Europe. It seemed that little Bohemia was capable of bringing the entire empire to its knees, but internal strife continued to undermine the Hussites' strength. The moderate Calixtines, tired of the endless war, increasingly sought ways to reconcile with the Catholic world. In 1433, at the Council of Basel, they managed to agree on a compromise, the so-called Basel Compacts. The Church, exhausted by defeats, agreed to allow communion in both kinds in Bohemia, in exchange for recognition of the council's authority and the return of church property. For the radical Taborites and orphans, this was a betrayal. They refused to recognize the compacts, and then former allies, the Calixtines, united with Catholic lords and moved against them. On May 30th, 1434, at the Battle of Lipany, a decisive battle took place. The army of the radicals, using the old Wagenburg tactic, was defeated with a military ruse. The moderates feigned a retreat, lured the Taborites out of their wheeled fortress, and then struck them from the flanks. Prokop the Great and almost the entire flower of the Taborite and orphan warriors perished in this battle. The Battle of Lipany put an end to the Hussite Wars. The radical movement was decapitated. The way to compromise was open. Sigismund was finally recognized as King of Bohemia, but on the terms of the Basel Compacts. Thus ended this great and terrible epic, an epic at the center of which, like a rock, stood the figure of a blind warrior who taught peasants to defeat knights. Jan Žižka died. His army was eventually defeated, and the radical wing of the Hussites was destroyed. Does this mean that his life's work was a failure? The answer to this question is complex and multifaceted. On the one hand, the Taborites' dream of building a kingdom of God on earth, based on complete equality, remained just a dream. The utopia did not come to pass. Bohemia returned to the fold of European monarchies, albeit with a special status. But on the other hand, the legacy of Žižka and the Hussite movement is immense. Firstly, there is the religious legacy. For 2 centuries, Hussite Bohemia became the first country in Europe where, with the consent of an ecumenical council, 2 faiths officially coexisted. This was an unprecedented breakthrough in an era when religious dissent was punished by death. The Hussite movement became a forerunner of the great European Reformation of the 16th century. Martin Luther, beginning his struggle with Rome, would say, "We are all Hussites without knowing it." The chalice for which Žižka fought became a symbol of the struggle for freedom of conscience. Secondly, there is the national legacy. The Hussite Wars were a powerful catalyst for the formation of Czech national consciousness. The struggle against foreign crusaders and German domination united the nation. Jan Hus and Jan Žižka became and remain the greatest national heroes of the Czech people, symbols of their struggle for independence and identity. Thirdly, and this is perhaps Žižka's most famous legacy, is his contribution to the art of war. He was a true revolutionary in tactics and strategy. His use of the Wagenburg, the mass use of firearms, the interaction of different branches of the military, iron discipline, all this was a century ahead of its time. He showed how to defeat professional armies by relying not on force, but on intelligence, organization, and innovation. His tactical methods were studied by commanders throughout Europe. He stands in the same rank as the greatest military innovators in history. The figure of Žižka himself remained complex and contradictory. For Catholic Europe, he was a bloody heretic, a destroyer of churches, the Scourge of God. For his followers, an invincible leader, a Moses leading his people to the Promised Land. In the 19th century, during the era of national revival, he became a romantic hero, a fighter for freedom. In the 20th century, communist propaganda tried to present him as the leader of a peasant revolution and class struggle. But whoever he was, a fanatical warrior of faith, a brilliant tactician, or a Czech patriot, one thing is certain. Jan Žižka was a man of titanium, a man who, in an age of knights and castles, created a people's army and forced the entire world to reckon with the will of a small but proud nation. He proved that strength of spirit, faith in one's righteousness, and military genius can be stronger than steel, gold, and papal curses. The blind commander, who never lost a single battle, still looks at us from the depths of the centuries as an eternal symbol of the indomitable will to freedom. Thank you for your attention. If this story seemed interesting to you and you wish to continue immersing yourselves in the most exciting and dramatic pages of the past, please subscribe to our channel, leave your comments, and share this video. Many more amazing journeys through time await us.